The golden halls of Thebes shimmered under the glow of hundreds of oil lamps. Incense curled through the air, its rich scent mingling with the distant echoes of temple chants. The palace was alive with celebration tonight, was not a night of war, but of honor. At the heart of it all, standing before the grand throne of Pharaoh Khafre, was General Rahotep. His broad shoulders, bronzed from years under the scorching desert sun, bore the scars of countless battles fought in his king's name. Kneeling, he bowed his head low, pressing his forehead against the cool marble floor. Rahotep. Pharaoh's voice rang strong and clear, filling the chamber. You have been my sword, my shield, my most trusted hand. Through blood and battle, through war and peace, you have never wavered. Today you are not just my general, you are my brother in all but name. A murmur of approval swept through the gathered nobles and warriors. The viziers, dressed in fine linen, watched with measured pride, while temple priests whispered prayers of blessing. Servants poured wine into golden goblets, ready for the toast that would mark this sacred vow. Rahotep lifted his gaze, his dark eyes burning with unswerving loyalty. My Pharaoh, my life belongs to you. My blade shall never turn against you. My heart shall never waver. By the gods, by the sands, by my very soul, I am yours until death claims me. The room erupted in cheers. Khafre stepped forward, taking Rahotep's hand and raising him to his feet. The two men clasped arms more than ruler and subject, more than warrior and king. They were bound by fate, by trust, by something deeper than mere duty. But in the shadowed corners of the hall, a lone figure stood unmoving. A high priest, his aged face lined with years of devotion to the gods, observed the scene with darkened eyes. When the cheers quieted, his frail voice cut through the air, like a whisper of doom. A great warrior, the priest murmured, his voice barely above a breath. A heart unshaken by war, but not immune to love. Beware, Pharaoh, for all oaths are tested by the gods. A hush fell over the court. The words slithered through the air, curling into ears like an unseen serpent. But Pharaoh only laughed, shaking his head. My faith in Rahotep is unbreakable, he declared. No prophecy, no priest, no force in this world can change that. And Rahotep, standing tall beneath the golden light, believed it too. Yet somewhere, hidden within the vast halls of Thebes, unseen eyes watched him not with admiration, but with something far more dangerous. Something that would test the very oath he had sworn this night. For love was a force greater than loyalty, and fate was already in motion. The city of Thebes had seen many rulers rise and fall, but none as revered as Pharaoh Khafre. He was a man of unwavering ambition, a ruler who wielded power with the confidence of a god. Yet behind his golden mask of authority, there was one man he trusted beyond all others, Rahotep. They had been boys once, running barefoot through the palace gardens, laughing as they sparred with wooden swords. Khafre, born to rule, and Rahotep, born to serve. Their fates had been written in the stars long before they had taken their first breath. Yet, despite the divide of rank, a deep bond had grown between them, forged through childhood mischief and the trials of war. Rahotep had proven his loyalty time and time again. On the battlefield, he had stood as Khafre's shield, his sword cutting down all who dared threaten the pharaoh's rule. He had bled for his king, sacrificed his own desires for the sake of duty, and in return, Khafre had rewarded him with power, wealth, and honor. But in the silent moments between war and victory, Rahotep sometimes wondered, was there anything more to life than serving? He had spent years chasing glory, yet his heart remained empty. untouched by anything beyond devotion to his pharaoh. He did not know it yet, but the gods had already begun to weave a different fate for him, a fate that would lead him away from the path of loyalty and into the arms of forbidden love. And it would begin on the sacred steps of the Temple of Isis. The Temple of Isis stood like a vision of the heavens, its towering columns bathed in the golden light of dusk. The air was thick with the scent of lotus and burning myrrh, and the distant chants of priestesses echoed through the sacred halls. It was here, in this place, untouched by war and bloodshed, that Rahotep first laid eyes on Layla. She moved like a whisper of the Nile, her white robes flowing with each step. The flickering torchlight caught the deep kohl lining her eyes, making them seem endless, unreadable. Rahotep had faced enemies twice his size, had stood in the heart of battle without fear, but in that moment, he felt something stir within him, something unfamiliar. She was speaking with a group of priestesses when their eyes met. It was brief, like the brush of a breeze, but enough to leave a mark. Rahotep did not believe in omens, but the way the air seemed to still around her made him wonder if the gods had placed her in his path for a reason. He should have looked away. A warrior had no place among priestesses. Their lives were devoted to the gods, untouched by earthly desires. But Rahotep found himself lingering, watching her from the shadows of the temple pillars. As if sensing his gaze, Layla turned once more. This time, she did not look away. A small, knowing smile played at her lips before she disappeared into the inner sanctum of the temple. Rahotep exhaled, his chest tight with something he could not yet name. And so, the first stone of his fate had been placed. Rahotep could not forget her. Days passed, yet the image of Layla lingered in his mind like a half-remembered dream. He saw her eyes in the stillness of the night, heard her voice in the whispers of the wind. It made no sense. He had spent his life serving Pharaoh, with no time for distractions. And yet, the memory of a single glance haunted him. He told himself it was nothing, a passing curiosity. But curiosity became longing, and longing became something dangerous. One evening, under the pretense of seeking a blessing from the gods, Rahotep returned to the Temple of Isis. The priestesses moved gracefully through the halls, chants filling the air with an eerie calm. He had no right to be here, yet he walked deeper into the temple, his heart pounding like war drums. And then he saw her. Layla knelt before an altar, her head bowed in prayer. The glow of oil lamps bathed her in golden light, making her seem almost unreal. He should have turned away before his presence was noticed. But then she lifted her gaze and met his eyes. "You do not belong here, warrior," she said softly. Rahotep's breath caught. She was not afraid, nor did she lower her gaze in submission as most women did in his presence. There was something in her voice, something knowing, as if she could already see the storm building within him. "I seek the wisdom of the gods," he answered. It was not entirely a lie, though the wisdom he sought was not from the divine. Layla studied him for a long moment before a small, unreadable smile touched her lips. "Then let us see if the gods are willing to grant it." She turned and disappeared into the temple's inner sanctum, leaving Rahotep standing alone in the dim torchlight. For the first time in his life, he felt unsure of the path ahead. And yet, despite the warnings in his mind, he knew he would return. Rahotep knew he was walking a dangerous path, but he could not turn back. Night after night, he returned to the Temple of Isis, always under the cover of darkness. At first, he told himself it was only to speak with Layla, to understand the wisdom she carried. But with each meeting, his heart betrayed him more. Their conversations were unlike anything he had ever known. She spoke not of war, not of power, but of the stars, of fate, of love, and its defiance of the gods. "You are bound to Pharaoh," she whispered one evening as they stood beneath the temple's stone archways. "Your loyalty is your chain." Rahotep tensed, but Layla only smiled, tracing her fingers along the smooth stone of the pillar beside her. "Do you not wish to be free?" Freedom. It was a word he had never considered. His life had been given to Pharaoh, his purpose carved in stone before he could speak his own desires. But now, when he looked at Layla, he saw another future one, where he was not a servant, not a warrior, but simply a man. It was a dangerous thought. And yet, when Layla's fingers brushed against his, he did not pull away. One stolen touch became many. Whispered words turned into longing glances. A forbidden love growing in the shadows of the temple walls. Rahotep did not know how long they could keep this secret. He only knew that, for the first time in his life, his heart was no longer Pharaoh's. It belonged to Layla. Rumors spread like desert windslant, unseen, but impossible to contain. At first, no one questioned Rahotep's late-night absences. He was Pharaoh's most trusted warrior, a man who answered only to the king himself. But whispers have a way of finding the ears that wish to hear them. It started with a servant who noticed Rahotep slipping into the streets of Thebes long after the palace had gone to rest. Then a temple guard who swore he saw a shadow moving beyond the columns of the temple of Isis. A royal advisor took note of Rahotep's distracted gaze during council meetings, his thoughts clearly far from Pharaoh's affairs. Pharaoh Khafre dismissed these murmurs at first. He had known Rahotep his entire life, loyal, unshakable Rahotep, a man who had never once questioned his duty. But doubt is like a drop of ink in clear water. Once it is there, it spreads. One evening, as Rahotep stood by Pharaoh's side in the great hall, the royal advisor leaned in, voice low. "My king, the general has been distracted. Some say he visits the temple far too often." Khafre's expression darkened. "And what is in the temple that would interest a man like Rahotep?" The advisor hesitated. "A woman, my pharaoh." The words struck like a blade. Khafre turned his gaze to Rahotep, watching him in silence. A feeling stirred within him, something unspoken, something dangerous. Loyalty, once absolute, was now in question. And for the first time, Pharaoh wondered, was there truth in the whispers? The moon hung low over Thebes, casting silver light upon the sacred temple walls. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh. But Rahotep barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the words Layla had spoken that evening, words that made his blood run cold. "They plan to sacrifice me," she had whispered, her hands trembling in his. Rahotep had thought she meant it metaphorically, that the priestesses would cast her out for her forbidden love. But her eyes held terror real, undeniable. "The high priest believes I have angered the gods," she continued, her voice barely a breath. "In 3 days I will be given to the Nile." Rahotep felt rage coil inside him like a serpent. The thought of losing her, of watching her slip beneath the waters, was unbearable. "Then we leave," he said, his grip tightening. "Tonight." But before she could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the temple corridors. Layla's eyes widened in fear. "Go," she urged, pushing him toward the shadows. Rahotep hesitated, but it was too late. The doors burst open, and the high priest entered, flanked by temple guards. His aged face twisted in fury as he pointed at Rahotep. "Blasphemer!" the priest roared. "You defile the house of the gods." Rahotep reached for his dagger, instincts honed by war taking over. The guards rushed forward. Layla screamed his name. Steel flashed in the dim light, and in a single moment, Rahotep sealed his fate. The temple erupted into chaos. The high priest's shouts rang through the halls, calling upon the gods to witness the sin that had been committed in their sacred space. Rahotep did not hesitate. His blade struck swiftly, silencing the priest's cries with a single fatal thrust. Blood bloomed across the elder's pristine robes, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The temple guards hesitated, their eyes wide with shock. The great warrior, Pharaoh's most loyal servant, had just slain a holy man. This was no longer just blasphemy, it was treason against the gods themselves. Layla gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her lips. "Rahotep, what have you done?" There was no time to answer. The guards recovered from their shock and lunged. Rahotep fought with all the skill war had gifted him, his movements swift and precise. But there were too many. Blades slashed through the air, fists struck like hammers, and though he brought down several men, he was soon overwhelmed. A crushing blow to his head sent him sprawling onto the temple floor. His vision blurred, the scent of blood and incense mingling in his senses. Through the haze, he saw Layla being dragged away, her cries piercing through the pounding in his skull. Then, darkness swallowed him whole. When he awoke, cold iron shackles bound his wrists. The temple walls were gone, replaced by the towering pillars of the pharaoh's great hall. The throne loomed ahead, and upon it sat Khafre. His expression was unreadable. His voice, when he spoke, was not that of a friend but of a ruler passing judgment. "You have betrayed me, Rahotep." And with those words, the fate of the once loyal warrior was sealed. The great hall of Thebes had never been so silent. Nobles, priests, and warriors stood in solemn rows, their gazes fixed upon the kneeling figure at the center of the chamber. Rahotep, once the pride of Pharaoh's army, was now a prisoner, his wrists bound in heavy chains, his face bloodied from the temple struggle. Atop the golden throne, Pharaoh Khafre sat unmoving. His expression was carved from stone, unreadable even to those who knew him best. But his Aisha's eyes held something dark, something raw. "Rahotep." Khafre's voice echoed through the chamber, low and heavy. "You were my brother in all but name, my sword, my shield, the man I trusted above all others." Rahotep did not lower his gaze. "And I have never wavered in my loyalty to you, my pharaoh." "Then explain the blood on your hands," Khafre said, his voice sharpening. "Explain why the high priest lies dead, why you defiled the god's temple for a woman." The court murmured in hushed voices. Rahotep's jaw clenched. He could see Layla now, standing between two guards, her wrists bound, but her posture unbroken. She looked at him with eyes that carried both love and sorrow. "I did what I had to," Rahotep said, his voice steady. "They would have killed her." "And so you chose her life over your duty to me?" Khafre asked. Rahotep's silence was answer enough. The pharaoh exhaled slowly, leaning back against his throne. He was no longer just a man questioning a friend, he was a ruler weighing justice. The court waited with bated breath. "You have broken sacred laws," Khafre said at last. "Betrayed the gods, betrayed me." The sentence was clear before it was spoken. "Your punishment is death." A gasp rippled through the chamber, but Rahotep did not flinch. He had expected this. "What of Layla?" he asked. Khafre hesitated. The room was silent, all eyes on their king. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his gaze. "The gods will decide her fate," he said. Rahotep's fists clenched. He could accept his own death, But Lailash could not suffer for his sins. And so he made one final plea. If you ever called me brother, spare her. Khafra's face darkened. The weight of friendship, of betrayal, of love, of all the tangled emotions hung heavy between them. The judgment was not yet over. The great hall was silent, yet the weight of unspoken words pressed heavily upon Pharaoh Khafre. He sat upon his golden throne, his expression unreadable. But inside, a storm raged. Rahotep's brother in battle, the man who had stood beside him through war and bloodshed, knelt in chains before him, condemned to die. And for what? For love? For a woman? Khafre's fingers curled into fists against the armrests of his throne. His advisors, the priests, and the nobles all waited for him to speak. But he hesitated. His mind was not in the hall, it was in the past. He remembered the boyhood days when he and Rahotep trained with wooden swords in the palace gardens, swearing loyalty to each other before they even understood what loyalty meant. He remembered the battlefield where Rahotep had stood before him, unyielding, facing death without fear. How many times had Rahotep saved his life? How many times had he put duty above all else? And yet, when it mattered most, Rahotep had chosen love over Pharaoh. Khafre's chest tightened. Was it betrayal? Or was it something else, something greater? Something he, as Pharaoh, could never understand? His gaze flickered to Layla. She stood between the guards, her head held high despite the chains around her wrists. There was no pleading in her eyes, no fear, only sorrow. The gods will decide her fate, he had said moments ago, but the words felt empty. He was Pharaoh. It was not the gods who decided, it was him. And yet, what choice did he have? To spare Rahotep would mean defying the gods, breaking the sacred laws of Ma'at. His own people would question his rule. But to kill him, to end the life of the man who had been his most loyal companion, would that not be a greater betrayal? For the first time since ascending the throne, Pharaoh Khafre felt powerless. The law demanded death. His heart demanded mercy. And he did not know which would destroy him more. Pharaoh Khafre's breath was slow and measured. But inside, his heart pounded like the drums of war. He had fought battles, conquered lands, and ruled with the authority of a god, but never had he faced a decision as agonizing as this. Rahotep knelt before him, unbroken despite the chains that bound him. His dark eyes held no fear, only resolve. He had made peace with his fate. But when Khafre looked at Layla, he saw something different. She was not pleading. She was not weeping. Yet, in the depths of her gaze, there was something undeniable of. A love so powerful that it had driven a man like Rahotep, a warrior of unshakable loyalty, to defy his own king. Khafre swallowed hard. He had always believed loyalty was absolute, that Rahotep would stand beside him until death. But now he saw the truth. There was a force greater than loyalty, greater than duty, and he could not fight it. Slowly, Khafre stood, his golden robes flowing around him like the sands of time. The hall held its breath, waiting for his judgment. "Rahotep," he said, his voice steady, though his soul was anything but. "You have broken the sacred laws. You have spilled the blood of the gods chosen. For this, there is no forgiveness." The words felt like iron in his mouth. Rahotep bowed his head. "I understand, my Pharaoh." Khafre clenched his jaw. "You will be granted an honorable warrior's death," he declared. "You may die with dignity, as a soldier, not as a traitor." A murmur rippled through the court. It was mercy more than most had expected. But it was not enough for Rahotep. He lifted his head, his gaze sharp. And Layla? Khafre exhaled slowly. He had not yet spoken her fate, but he had already decided. She will live, he said at last. She is banished from Thebes, never to return. A gasp swept through the crowd. Some priests whispered in disapproval she had defiled the sacred temple. And yet, she was spared? Rahotep closed his eyes, exhaling in relief. She would live. That was all that mattered. Layla, however, stood frozen. Her fate was sealed, but her heart was not at peace. No, she whispered, stepping forward despite the guards holding her back. I do not wish to live without him. Khafre's expression darkened. You would choose death? Layla met his gaze without hesitation. I would choose love. A silence heavier than stone filled the hall. Khafre looked between them, the warrior who had been his brother, and the woman who had stolen his heart. His hands curled into fists. And then, without another word, he turned his back. The judgment had been made. Rahotep and Layla would meet their fate together. The execution was set for dawn. The palace courtyard, once a place of celebration and triumph, had become a stage for tragedy. Torches flickered against the dark sky as the people of Thebes gathered in silence. Some came out of duty, others out of curiosity. But none could ignore the weight of what was about to unfold. Rahotep stood tall, unshaken, as the guards led him to the stone platform. He did not fight. He did not beg. He had faced death 100 times before this time would be no different. But as he turned his head, his heart clenched. Layla stood beside him. She had not run. She had not pleaded for mercy. She had simply chosen to die by his side. Khafre watched from the balcony above, his face carved from stone. He had given Layla a chance to live. She had refused. And now, he would watch as the two people who had betrayed him met their end. Rahotep's hands tightened into fists. You do not have to do this, he whispered to Layla. She smiled softly, her fingers brushing his. I have no life without you. A priest stepped forward, reciting prayers to the gods. The executioner raised his blade. The moment had come. Rahotep turned to Layla one last time, his heart breaking even as it swelled with love. And as the sun began to rise over Thebes, their souls became one. The gods had taken everything from them in life, but in death they were finally free. The sun rose over Thebes, golden light spilling across the city. But in Pharaoh Khafre's heart, there was only darkness. He sat alone in his chamber, the cheers of the people still echoing in the distance. They called it justice, a necessary punishment, the will of the gods. But Khafre felt no victory. He had seen countless men fall in battle, had ordered the deaths of traitors and rebels without hesitation. Yet nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever weighed so heavily on his soul. Rahotep had been more than his general. He had been his brother, the one man who had never abandoned him until love had pulled him away. Khafre had told himself that duty must come before all else, that his hands were tied by law and tradition. But as he looked at the empty throne beside him, the place where Rahotep had once stood, he could not escape the truth. He had lost him, and Layla, her defiance, haunted him. The way she had chosen death so willingly, as if love mattered more than life itself. Could he, Pharaoh of all Egypt, ever understand such devotion? A servant entered, bowing low. My Pharaoh, the bodies have been taken. What are your orders? Khafre's throat tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. Build them a tomb. The servant hesitated. "A tomb, my lord?" Khafre turned his gaze to the horizon, where the sun burned like an unforgiving god. "They will not be forgotten." For the first time, Pharaoh Khafre questioned whether justice had truly been served. Time moved forward, but the story of Rahotep and Layla never faded. The people of Thebes whispered of the warrior who had once stood unshakable at Pharaoh's side, only to be undone by love. They spoke of the priestess who had defied the gods themselves, choosing death over a life without the man she loved. Some called it a tragedy, others a curse. But to those who understood love's power, it was something else. A legend. At Pharaoh Khafre's command, a tomb was built outside the grand city walls, carved into the stone cliffs that overlooked the Nile. It was not the tomb of a traitor, nor a warrior. It was a tomb for two souls who had dared to love beyond what the gods allowed. No royal ceremony was held. No grand inscriptions of their crimes. Only a single carving, etched into the stone. Bound by love, freed by death. Khafre visited the tomb only once. He stood before it as the wind howled across the cliffs, his royal robes fluttering like the wings of a falcon. He had lost a brother. He had lost a friend. And in his heart, though he would never say it aloud, he knew he had lost a part of himself. "Perhaps you were right," he murmured, voice barely audible against the wind. "Perhaps love is greater than loyalty." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the past behind. Years passed. Pharaohs rose and fell. Kingdoms changed. But deep in the cliffs of Thebes, their tomb remained, untouched, unforgotten. And whenever the wind whispered through the valley, some swore they could still hear the echoes of a love too strong for even death to silence. Rahotep and Layla were gone, but their love lived forever.